Welcome back. In this video, we are talking all about replicability of psychology. And of course, my thing is not working. Okay. Let's start that again. Welcome back. In this video, we are talking all about replicability in psychology. So replication is a central part of the scientific process. As we know, replication is repeating a study and seeing if you get the same results from redoing the study. There are two different types of replication that researchers can do. The first is called exact replication, and this is when a second set of researchers repeats the study that the first set of researchers did using the exact same methods, the exact same materials. The only thing that's different is maybe that they're in a different location and using a different sample, but the rest of the study is exactly the same. There's also conceptual replication. So this is where researchers are investigating to see if the same constructs have the same relationship when using slightly different materials. So looking at the relationship through a slightly different lens to see if it's still there. Now, each of these types of replications has its own merit. Sometimes you need to do exact replications in order to make sure the methodology is sound. Sometimes you want to do conceptual replications to see how far you can push the relationship that was found in the original study. But regardless of the type of replication that you are doing, more replications of an effect ultimately leads to more confidence in the finding of that effect. So replications are a really key component in the scientific process to understand what is actually true about our world. But in psychology, we have been going through what is called the replication crisis. So around 2010, so about 10 years ago now, the cracks start to show in psychology. There are psychological studies, psychological quote unquote facts that could not be replicated. These are things that people just took to be true, that made it out into the popular culture, similar to the power posing that we saw in the first video. But they're not replicating. When people are trying to do the studies again, they aren't finding the same results. They're often finding no effects whatsoever. One study actually found that only 39% of replications were finding the same effects as the original studies. That's really low. That means that like 61% of studies weren't replicable, which is huge, right? Over half of the studies in psychology were not being replicated, so we don't actually know if the results are indicating the true relationships that were being investigated. Now, certain subfields of psychology were hit harder than others. For example, social psychology took it really hard. A lot of the facts that they had, they were not replicating. The relationships were not there. And a lot of their theories started crumbling to the ground. So the field of psychology for the past 10 years has been trying to kind of reckon with this replication crisis and address all of the issues that it reveals. But so in order to address those issues, we first need to think about why those issues came around in the first place. And a lot of it can be traced back to what are called questionable research practices, or QRPs for short. So these QRPs are practices that researchers do throughout the research process that are maybe not entirely scientifically sound, but also usually aren't outright wrong. So one of them is failing to report all the measures in a study, all of the conditions that are used. And that's just important because we need to know what was tested in order to understand where there were relationships and where there weren't relationships but people were only showing where there were those relationships. So a lot of findings that didn't result in any sort of statistically significant relationship weren't making it out into the public. There's also the issue of changing the amount of data that was collected based on results. So sometimes what researchers would do is they would collect a sample, run their statistics, see that they didn't have a statistically significant result. So then they decided to add more participants, run their statistics again, and then, oh my goodness, this time it is statistically significant. So that means we found an effect. This has some statistical implications that I won't go into today, but just know that this practice is definitely not scientifically sound. There's also the flip side of that, where they would stop collection early if they found a statistically significant result. So both of these practices do not fit in line with statistical practices for good science. There's also the issue of the file drawer problem. So this is where people would run a study, they would get null results, which means they did not have a scientific or a statistically significant finding, and so they wouldn't even try to publish it. They did not put it out into the world. They put it in their file drawer, locked the key, and never thought about it again. This is a problem because we need to know what didn't work to know why things that do work, work. So there are a lot of results out there that we don't actually know what they are because they're locked away. Another reason why the replication crisis happens is p-hacking. So this is something that you'll be doing in the exercise for this week. P-hacking is when you change your analysis in order to get a statistically significant result. So you could add variables, remove variables, define them slightly differently. So instead of using age, for example, as a continuous variable, maybe you break it up into groups. So you have the younger group and the older group, and like maybe you find an effect that way, but not when it's a continuous variable. So those are some examples of p-hacking. And basically what this means is that people are reporting effects, but they change their statistics in order to find an effect. So again, we don't know if the effect is real. On the other side of that is a practice called harking, or hypothesizing after the results are known. So this is where people would run a study, run their statistics, see what their statistics said, and then go back and write their introduction to their paper and say, oh, we predicted this result all along. A little flawed, right? We know how the scientific process should work. And then lastly, falsifying data. This one is not so questionable. This is pretty much wrong. So people would just create false data sets, publish reports on those data sets, and so they would be completely fabricated and incorrect. So we have all of these questionable research practices that psychologists were taking a part in. And you may be asking yourself, well, why are they even doing these questionable research practices? Shouldn't they know better? The answer is yes. But there is a very competitive atmosphere of academia. So you may have heard of the phrase publish or perish, where researchers need to keep publishing work, publishing new studies in order to be promoted or sometimes even keep their job. So there's a feeling that they need to get their work out there, and often only positive effects, so finding an effect and finding a statistically significant effect is the only way that they could publish. So there are a lot of different structural issues that led to this replication crisis happening. So what's being done? Well, researchers, journals, institutions such as universities are issuing higher levels of accountability. So researchers are holding themselves accountable, raising their own standards. But then you also see journals and institutions like universities holding researchers accountable. So certain journals require open science practices. You can even get like little badges on your paper if you do some of the practices that we'll talk about in following videos. And some universities are also starting to require researchers partake in different open science practices. There are also different organizations that are really meant to educate researchers and think of different ways to improve psychology. So there's the open science framework, which we'll be talking about throughout some other videos, which allows researchers to share information, but also provides a little bit of education about open science. And there's the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, which does exactly what it sounds like it does. And then there are also discussions among researchers. So researchers talking to each other in different ways. These can be formal discussions happening at conferences, or informal discussions like Twitter feeds and lots of different things like that. So there are different ways that open science is helping to address the replicability issue. All right. In our next video, we are going to cover different types of open science publications.